Reaching some parts of Alaska is extremely difficult. In some areas, you might not see a single vehicle for months. Even emergency response teams can take days to reach certain locations after receiving a distress call. For those who don't know, Alaska is the largest state in the United States, covering nearly 660,000 square miles of land. Because of its size, traveling across large parts of the state by normal road access is nearly impossible. That's why many people rely on small planes, boats, or snowmobiles to get around. The Alaska Wildlife Troopers, however, patrol areas that most people will never see in their entire lives. Abandoned locations, remote river corridors, regions where human activity is almost non-existent. Some calls involve poaching investigations, others involve missing persons cases. But the hardest part is in many of the places they enter, there are no security cameras, no cell service, and sometimes no witnesses at all. Which means that in certain cases, the only thing left behind is a short field report written by the responding officers. And according to those reports, some of these incidents remain unexplained to this day. So, if you're ready, let's examine 5 cases documented by the Alaska Wildlife Troopers and were never officially solved. Case 1. The camp that was left in the middle of a meal. When the trooper reached the remote hunting camp on the Togiak River, the fire was still warm. 2 plates of food were on the camp table, partially eaten, and both licensed hunters registered to the camp were gone, their rifles still inside the tent, their float planes still moored at the bank, and no note, no radio call, and no track leading away from camp in any direction the ground could hold an impression. The Togiak Wilderness in southwest Alaska covers over 4.7 million acres of roadless terrain between Bristol Bay and the Akloon Mountains. It is accessible only by small aircraft or riverboat and sees concentrated hunting activity during moose and brown bear seasons. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game requires hunters in this area to register their camps, file float plans with their aircraft operator, and maintain radio contact with a designated check-in point. These requirements exist precisely because the terrain offers almost no margin for error. The 2 hunters, both experienced Alaska residents with multiple prior seasons in the Togiak, had filed a complete float plan and checked in on schedule the morning of the incident. The trooper who conducted the welfare check had been dispatched after the afternoon radio check went unanswered. The float plane operator who had dropped them had a scheduled pickup the following morning and had flagged the missed check-in through the standard notification chain. The camp itself showed no signs of a hasty departure. The tent was properly staked, personal gear was stowed, 1 hunter's GPS unit was on the camp table beside the food. Both rifles were in the tent vestibule, not hung or secured, but placed as if the hunters had set them down briefly and intended to return. The fire had been built up recently enough that the trooper could feel residual heat from the coals. What makes this case unusual is the ground condition around the camp. The Togiak riverbank in that area is a combination of soft silt and compressed grass that holds impressions well. The trooper documented boot tracks within the camp perimeter, at the fire, at the tent entrance, at the table. Those tracks ended at the camp boundary. There were no tracks leading into the brush, no tracks towards the river, no tracks towards the aircraft. The impressions that existed showed 2 people present in camp. They showed no one leaving. A multi-agency search was conducted over 4 days, with aircraft support. The Togiak River corridor and adjacent drainages were covered extensively. No remains, no gear, no additional sign was located. The float plane was eventually retrieved by the operator. The hunters were never found. The case was classified as missing persons presumed deceased after the statutory period. The track evidence documented in the initial report, boots present in camp, no departure tracks, was noted and not explained. Alaska wildlife troopers and search and rescue personnel familiar with backcountry disappearances noted that the track documentation is the most anomalous element of this case. People who walk away from camp voluntarily or otherwise leave tracks. Soft riverbank silt is among the most reliable tracking surfaces available. The absence of departure tracks in material that clearly held arrival tracks is not something that standard explanations for wilderness disappearances account for. For those wondering, this case still remains in the official records of the Alaska Wildlife Troopers. The notes and field reports written that night are still preserved as part of the official case file. However, even after the case was reviewed years later, what the patrol officer actually encountered near the camp was never fully explained. Case 3. The moose that the dogs would not approach. A subsistence hunter reported a moose carcass on his trapline that his 2 experienced sled dogs, animals that had worked around moose, bear, and wolf kills for years without incident, refused to approach within 40 meters, circling the perimeter continuously for over an hour, before he finally examined it himself and found that it showed no cause of death, no predator sign, no wound, and no physical deterioration consistent with the estimated time it had been there. The Susitna Valley in south-central Alaska runs north from the Upper Cook Inlet into the Alaska Range foothills. It is primarily accessible by snowmobile in winter and is used extensively for subsistence trapping, hunting, and fishing by local communities. The valley sees significant brown bear and wolf activity, and subsistence users in the area are experienced readers of animal behavior and sign. People who can age a track, assess a kill site, and distinguish between cause of death indicators with the kind of practical knowledge that comes from decades of work in that specific terrain. The hunter who reported the incident had been running his trapline for over 30 years when he filed the report with Alaska Wildlife Troopers. He noted 2 specific anomalies beyond the dog behavior. The carcass showed no raven or magpie activity, which is essentially impossible for a dead moose in that area. Ravens find carcasses within hours and begin working them immediately. And the snow within a 10-meter radius of the animal was undisturbed, with no predator tracks, no drag marks, and no blood. What makes this case unusual is the combination of those 3 elements: dog avoidance, absence of scavenger activity, and undisturbed snow. Each individually might have a mundane explanation. A sick or diseased animal might be avoided by dogs. Scavengers sometimes take time to locate a carcass. In dense terrain, fresh snow can obscure older tracks. But this carcass was in an open area with clear sight lines. The snow was several days old with no subsequent snowfall, and the hunter estimated the animal had been dead for at least 3 days based on its physical condition. 3 days in which no bird had touched it. The trooper who responded examined the carcass and confirmed the hunter's observations. No cause of death was identifiable on visual examination. No predator or scavenger sign was present. A tissue sample was collected for laboratory analysis. The lab results, returned several weeks later, showed no toxicological abnormality, no known disease pathogen, and no indication of a cause of death that the available analysis could identify. The result was listed as undetermined. The laboratory report, included in the case file, lists the cause of death as undetermined. However, according to the notes written by the first officer who arrived at the scene, there were several unusual details that stood out in the area: the strange behavior of the dogs and the ravens, and the fact that the snow around the site appeared almost completely undisturbed. What makes the case even more unsettling is that most of those details were never fully explained, even after the investigation was reopened years later.
Case 3. The radio transmission from a closed station. During a patrol flight over the Wrangell-St. Elias backcountry, an Alaska wildlife trooper pilot received a transmission on a fish and game monitoring frequency from a remote station identifier that had been decommissioned and physically dismantled 18 months earlier. The transmission was clear, the identifier was accurate, and when the pilot diverted to the station's former location, there was nothing there. Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve is the largest national park in the United States, covering over 13 million acres of terrain that includes active glaciers, volcanic peaks, and river systems that drain some of the most intact wilderness remaining in North America. Alaska Department of Fish and Game maintained a network of remote monitoring stations throughout the region for decades, used to track fish passage, wildlife movement, and environmental conditions. Budget reductions led to the decommissioning of several stations, with equipment removed and structures demolished. The station whose identifier appeared in the transmission had been officially closed and physically cleared 18 months before the incident. The decommissioning was documented in Fish and Game records. The equipment had been flown out. The structure had been removed in compliance with Park Service requirements for minimal impact. The frequency the station had used was reassigned in the system. There was no operational reason for that identifier to appear on any active transmission. The transmission lasted approximately 20 seconds. The pilot noted it clearly, recognized the station identifier as one he had known from previous patrol work in the area, and initially assumed an administrative error had left some residual equipment active. When he diverted to the coordinates associated with the former station location, he found the cleared site, as documented: no structure, no equipment, no antenna, no power source, nothing that could have produced a transmission. What makes this case unusual is the specificity of the identifier. Fish and Game monitoring frequencies carry station-specific identifiers embedded in their transmission protocol, a sequence that identifies the originating unit. This is not a call sign that a person could guess or reproduce without access to the specific equipment or the technical documentation for that equipment, both of which had been removed from service. The identifier that appeared in the transmission was accurate for a station that no longer existed. The incident was reported to Fish and Game communications staff, who reviewed the frequency logs for that period. The transmission appeared in the automated log with the correct timestamp, the correct frequency, and the decommissioned station identifier. Communications staff had no explanation. The equipment associated with that identifier had been accounted for in the decommissioning inventory. A review of where that equipment had gone confirmed it was no longer in service in any capacity. Communication frequency logs related to the incident still remain in the official records today. The shutdown report is also still preserved in the Fish and Wildlife archives. What makes the case particularly unusual is that when those two documents are examined together, they appear to point to something that should not normally have been possible. But even after all these years, what actually happened in that moment was never fully explained, and to this day, the case is still considered one of the most mysterious records connected to Alaska wildlife troopers. Case 5. The cabin that was occupied according to every indicator except one. The trooper approached the remote cabin to conduct a welfare check and found smoke coming from the chimney, fresh snowmobile tracks in the yard, split wood stacked by the door, and a lantern burning in the window. And when he knocked and entered, the cabin was empty. The stove was loaded and burning, a meal was cooking on top of it, and there was no person inside, and no second tracks anywhere in the yard or surrounding snow. The Kuskokwim Mountains form the divide between the Yukon and Kuskokwim River drainages in western Alaska. The region is home to numerous remote cabins used for subsistence hunters, trappers, and fishermen, some privately owned, some maintained by state and federal agencies as emergency shelters.
Access in winter is almost exclusively by snowmobile or small aircraft. The cabin in question was a privately owned structure registered to a local subsistence user who had not been heard from in approximately 3 weeks, prompting the welfare check. The trooper approached the cabin by snowmobile from the east at approximately 200 meters. He could see smoke from the chimney and light in the window, both clear indicators of recent or current occupation. As he came closer, he observed fresh snowmobile tracks in the yard and a recently split wood stack by the entrance. These observations were consistent with someone being present. He knocked twice, announced himself, and received no response. He entered through the unlocked door. The interior was warm. The wood stove was burning with a recently loaded firebox. A pot of what appeared to be stew was simmering on the stovetop. Personal gear was stored appropriately, nothing in the disarray that would suggest a rapid departure. A rifle was on the rack by the door. The lantern on the table was burning at a level consistent with having been lit recently rather than burning down over an extended period. Every physical indicator in the cabin suggested someone had been there within the last 30 to 60 minutes. What makes this case unusual is the yard. The trooper conducted a complete exterior examination of the cabin and surrounding area. His own snowmobile tracks from the east were the only inbound tracks in the yard. The snowmobile tracks he had observed from a distance, the ones that had indicated recent arrival, led from the cabin to a storage shed 20 meters away and back. They were the only tracks in the yard other than his own, and they did not lead away from the cabin in any direction. There were no foot tracks anywhere outside the structure. The cabin's registered owner was located several days later at a community approximately 80 miles away. He had not been to the cabin in over 2 weeks and had no knowledge of anyone else having access to it or using it. A second examination of the cabin confirmed it was empty and showed no sign of recent occupation beyond what the trooper had documented on his initial visit. The stove had burned out, the food had spoiled, and the lantern had run dry. Everything was as the trooper had left it. No one had been there between his visit and the second examination. When the case file is examined, the statement given by the cabin's owner can still be found among the official records. The observation notes written by the teams assigned to investigate the area were also preserved inside the file. But the part that many people still cannot explain is this. According to estimates, the cabin had supposedly been abandoned for nearly 2 weeks. So who added wood to the stove? Who prepared the food? And who lit the lantern inside? What makes the case even stranger is that none of those questions were ever officially answered. Alaska wildlife troopers operate in conditions that make documentation both more difficult and more significant than in most law enforcement contexts. There are no traffic cameras, no bystanders, no secondary witnesses. What a trooper observes and records in a remote backcountry incident is frequently the only objective account of that incident that will ever exist. This gives the reports a particular weight and makes the anomalies they contain harder to dismiss. The 5 cases documented here involve 5 different categories of anomaly in 5 different regions of Alaska. The Togiak camp produced tracks that showed arrival and no departure. The Sisitna carcass produced behavioral responses from experienced animals and experienced scavengers that contradicted what should have been normal responses to a dead animal. The Wrangell St. Elias transmission came from equipment that no longer existed. The ANRWR tracks documented a physical state that the laws of snow compression do not permit. The Kuskokwim cabin showed every sign of occupation with no person present and no tracks indicating how that occupation could have occurred. What these cases share is not a geographic region or a category of incident. What they share is a specific type of evidentiary problem. The physical evidence present at each location was internally consistent. The tracks, the fire, the transmission, the carcass condition, but inconsistent with any available explanation for how it got there. In each case, the evidence documented what happened. In each case, that documentation stopped short of explaining how it was possible. Alaska's scale plays a role here that is worth acknowledging. In a state where millions of acres go unobserved for extended periods, where weather events can alter terrain rapidly, and where animal behavior is shaped by conditions that researchers are still working to fully understand, anomalous observations have more potential explanations available to them than they would in a controlled environment. This is precisely why the cases documented here are worth examining. They were filed by people who work in that environment, who know its explanations, and who documented these incidents specifically because the standard explanations did not apply. The reports are in the record. The anomalies are in the reports. The wilderness that produced them is still there, still largely unobserved, and still being patrolled by troopers who are trained to document what they find, whether or not what they find can be explained. Finally, Alaska wildlife troopers respond to hundreds of different incidents every year. Most of those reports involve poaching cases, injured animals, or routine emergencies in remote areas. But sometimes, like the 5 cases we examined today, they encounter incidents that are far more difficult to explain. Most cases are officially documented, investigated, and eventually closed. However,